when you plan things for 2 or 3 months ahead, you don't think it's gonna snow and ice in February. So thank you, Hearty Souls, for coming out. Just as a little bit of a reminder, there are restrooms down at the end of the hall here. If you need to go, don't feel shy about going. Okay? I'm going to introduce Doris Keevan-Franke. She is very involved with German history in St. Louis, but also German history as it ties in with the abolitionist period in St. Louis. So I'm going to just go ahead and let her speak. We are also very privileged to have Archer Alexander's descendants here tonight. Thank you all for coming. Some of them came from Kentucky, some as far as Atlanta. Wow. There were a couple of from Atlanta. I will say that the family from Atlanta actually had a little accident on the way in, so they deserve some sort of reward. So thank you guys very much. So Doris, thank you for doing this too.
Well, this all started out with Dawn asking me, could you do a little program for Black History Month? And I said, well, I happen to know the story of this Archer Alexander, but at that point, I didn't know everything I know tonight. So it's been a real fun journey. So I want to thank Dawn for allowing us to do this here tonight and for orchestrating the larger room than the library, because we wouldn't all fit in that library room. So thank you. And now I'm going to explain real quickly on how this has evolved. I had promised her to do this story, and you may have all caught last October a news article about the DNA connection between Archer Alexander and Muhammad Ali. Well, the gentleman that had done all that DNA history and been their family historian and had been working on this for like 30 years, he caught that little blog when I shared it with some people here in St. Louis. And when he did that, he sent a cryptic text to me and just said, "Do you know where Archer Alexander is buried?" And that question has led to so much adventure in the last few months, genealogical and historical, and gotten to know so many of the family. But most of the family I've just met today for the first time. So Keith here is the gentleman that asked me, "Do you know where Archer Alexander is buried?" So Keith Winstead, you want to introduce all of the rest of your family.
Well, first is Cedric Turner right here.
Hey guys.
He's the first.
Thank you for coming.
When we did that DNA test, you know, if it was just my third great-grandfather, nobody would know. Mm-hmm. But when it found out it was Muhammad Ali's third great-grandfather, then it made the paper. This is Muhammad Ali's first cousin. This is Cedric Turner.
And I'm prettier looking than he.
This is Ivy Alexander. So she's an Alexander. She's a direct descendant of Archer.
Yeah.
And Lily Ann. And over here, there's Muhammad Ali's brother, Rahman Ali.
Yes.
And there's his wife, Caroline.
Hi, Caroline. That's Earlene.
Earlene,
My
yes. That's
sister-in-law.
And,
This is Skippy, his wife.
Skip.
I mean, Skippy.
Earlene's husband, Skip.
Okay.
And,
John's up here in the back.
oh, okay. This guy right here is Muhammad Ali's #1 fan. And he knew Muhammad Ali when he was a young boy. And he has in his house he has a Muhammad Ali library, and it's Ali pictures and signatures, and he came all the way up here from New Orleans. When the Mardi Gras was going on in Louisiana.
I know you meant to say no.
No, yeah, that's right.
got one here too.
We say flowers tomorrow.
Second one.
George Wilson Alexander.
George Wilson Alexander.
He's the youngest direct descendant of our.
Oh,
And then I'm Brady Melton, and I'm third cousin to Ali and first cousin to Lillian.
and then we got some placement hanging over here. Oh, I'm sorry.
Norma.
This is Norma G.
From Atlanta?
Alexander. And her husband just passed away a week ago. And George helped me doing DNA research.
It was
So
thanks
George did DNA, George did family research, and also Ivy's father went to,
and that's what
genealogy.
helped clinch it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To make sure.
And what clinched it was, when I did a DNA test on 23andMe, I matched an anonymous person. And she had anonymous written on her information. And then there was an MA. Another person had MA and no other information. And I didn't know who either one of them was. But when I went to look at the anonymous one, I saw she made a mistake. She put paternal and maternal surnames in the information. And her paternal surnames was Clay and Grady.
That gave it
And
away.
maternal surnames was Boyd. So I knew that was a child of Muhammad Ali and his second wife, Belinda Boyd. So when I saw Miriam Ali, I asked her, did you do a DNA test? And she said, yes, I did. And she said she did it for medical reasons. But she didn't tell me that her father had did a DNA test. So I was still trying to figure out who this MA was. And then I looked down and it said, daughter, anonymous. So I clicked on anonymous and it was Mayman. It was his daughter. So then I knew that MA was Muhammad Ali. And when Muhammad Ali and myself and Mayman, we matched a guy, Stephen Alexander, as a fifth cousin. And on 23andMe, you could be related to somebody, and if you're fifth cousins, it's only going to show up about 25% of the time. So 75% of the time, people who are fifth cousins won't even show. But Muhammad showed, May showed, and I showed match to Stephen Alexander. And Stephen Alexander didn't have a tree on 23andMe. So I went 2 years before I even sent him a message, because somebody, a fifth cousin, with no tree, you're not going to find anything. So when I saw that he matched Muhammad and May and myself, then I called him. I tried to get in touch with him. And he never, I sent him messages on 23andMe and he never responded. But what he did, he put his paternal and maternal surnames, and he was from Michigan. And he's a black guy from Michigan. I mean from Illinois. So I went to Facebook and looked at all the Stephen Alexander. And I looked at I looked and see if their friends had these same paternal names. And I found a Stephen Alexander who had 3 matches, had friends with the same surnames as he had on his 23andMe account. And I sent him a message. And I said, are you the Stephen Alexander that did the test on 23andMe? And he sent a message back and he said, yeah, how'd you know? So he really didn't, he wasn't interested in it. I don't know why he did the test. But finally, I got him to send a tree. And he had to go to his sister or aunt and do a tree. And it comes, he's our 5th cousin, but his father would be our 4th cousin. And 4th cousins share the same 3rd great-grandparent.
wow. Keith, let's not forget the cousins back in back of you.
Oh, I'm sorry, almost sorry. This is Brenda Stoner. This is Connie Stoner. And, Stafford. And this is
Quad-say Stafford.
Stafford, yeah.
Thank you all for joining us.
So when Stephen gave me his tree, he knew Archie was his 4th great grandfather. he matched me on my mother's side. So there's 16 paths. I got 16 pairs of great-great-grandparents. He matched me on my mother's side, so I was able to eliminate 8 paths on my father's side. And on 8 paths on my mother's side, there was only one path that was common to Maymay, Mohammed, and myself, and that was through Wesley Alexander. So that made Archer Wesley's father. And it wasn't Archer, he wasn't the father of of Wesley's mother, because I knew Wesley's mother's parents' name. They were Jesse Hopkins and Patsy Fry. So, and then the last name, when they matched up, the last names were the same. So I thought, well, is it possible that I could be related to Stephen on his mother's side, and it's just a coincidence that Archie and Wesley had the same last name. So, good thing about 23andMe, they put a paternal surname, a paternal haplogroup when you do the match. And a paternal haplogroup is only passed to males. So if Archer has a paternal haplogroup, it's passed to his son, to his grandson, his great-grandson, and all the way down to Stephen, who I matched. So I got Stephen's paternal haplogroup, and then I got George Alexander to do a DNA test. And he did a DNA test, and his paternal haplogroup was the same. So that verified it.
So you can see, folks, he really worked hard at this.
No,
And I'd like to thank Doris for all the work she's done, and she's got people working with her to do work, because we didn't know anything about Archie. And she found out, and her people found out where Archie was buried, found out at St. Peter's Cemetery, because she's got the cemetery records, plus she has the burial records. So there's 2 separate sources.
Are you going to scoop my whole program?
2 separate sources. And she found James Alexander, the slave owner. He's found his will and his program record.
I just shared with him today some information that
I'm
I
gonna let you
had
do
just
that.
discovered.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've learned as much as they have. I mean, every family genealogy and journey is a little different, and you learn things as you're doing it. And I hadn't tried this already, darn. So that was the one thing we didn't do in advance. Oh, that's right. Well, after I met Keith and he asked me that question, I started wanting to answer the question. And when I shared it on social media and he contacted me, when he asked the question, do you know where Archer Alexander is buried? I'm old enough now that I hedge my bets, and I said, maybe. I didn't say I did, I didn't say I didn't. The following narrative was prepared without the intention of any kind of publication, but I have been led to think that it may be of use, not only as a reminiscence of the War of Secession, but as a fair presentation of slavery in the border states for the 20 or 30 years preceding the outbreak of the hostilities. Now, that was written in 1885 in a book by a gentleman named William Greenleaf Eliot. And that was why I said maybe, because the book tells the answer. Well, Archer Alexander was born in Virginia born to a family named Alexander, a John Alexander. And this John Alexander, he had a son. He died in 1828 in Rockbridge, Virginia. He had a son that after he died in 1828, this son, James H. Alexander, yes, it does get hard to keep them all straight, folks. James H. Alexander came to Missouri in 1829. Now, what Keith didn't share, but the other important part of Keith and his story is Keith isn't here in Dardenne Prairie. He's not here in St. Louis. He's researching, and has been for 30 years, an ancestor of his named Wesley Alexander. And he had never gotten past that. And all he knew was that Wesley was born about 1829, 30, 31. And then when he first told me the story, he actually even indicated that the baby might have just been dropped off in Louisville. And I'm like, well, that's not a very usual story. But it indicated an oral family history that the family had come through. And I knew that they'd come in 1829 because they come to this area in St. Charles County that we call Dardenne Prairie. And they were Presbyterians, and there were a lot of them. They were related to the McClures and some Campbells and Stewarts and some other families that had been established there for lots of years. So in 29, James H. Alexander comes through, and he settles in Dardenne Prairie. He is a young man, and unfortunately, at that time, there was a big cholera epidemic going on. And first his wife died, and then he dies, leaving 4 small children. So in St. Charles County, this is the area that they live at. When this happened, these 4 small children are left parentless and orphans, and the wife's uncle takes the children back to Virginia. But he leaves the slaves here. The slaves at that time, there were 10 of them, and they were left in charge of erecting a building, this building. It's still standing. So his name is William Campbell, and he is the great uncle, and he is in charge of this estate. And he is in charge of back and forth with the payments back to Virginia because of these children and all these family affairs. He's very active in the Presbyterian Church. He is in charge of these 10 slaves that had come in 1830, but by 1845, 15 or 10 more years afterwards, what happens is these slaves are parceled out. They are property. The oldest child, when the father had died, was 10 years old. By 1845, he'd reached majority, and so the property needs to be parceled out, divided. They're divided totally just by their value, not at all by families or kinship. At that point in that document, which I shared with Keith today, it says that when they came, they left, and they find that the property is of the estate. Louisa in 1845 has 7 children living with her. Their names are Eliza, Mary Ann, Lucinda, Archie, Jim, John, and Alexander. Today was the first day we got to actually put names to them. So these slaves are broken into 4 lots, and at that point, poor Louisa and Archie are separated. At that point, Archie goes to be owned by Richard H. Pittman, and Louisa becomes owned by a James Naylor. is a haystack. Slavery and the issue in this time period is not cut and dried one way or the other. What a haystack means is he owns slaves, but he considers himself a union man. And that is an account from a neighbor of his. That's what they called him. So he is a good man too. He believes in education, and he was a Methodist, involved in the Methodist University in education, a little different from the rest of his neighbors. And he owns Archie from about 1845-46 on until in January of 1863. And in January of 1863, what had happened at that point, you have to understand a little bit of what was going on in the country. Lincoln had issued his Emancipation Proclamation January 1st, 1863. It did not free the slaves here in Missouri. That didn't happen here. Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee, being border states, Lincoln did not want to mess with them and get involved in their politics. However, two other things though that did do is it allowed for the creation of U.S. colored troops. It also made it a treasonous affair if somebody did treason against the government, thereby that slave is free, which figures in importantly into Archie's story. So on a cold night in February 28th, 1863.
Today?
Yes. Archie, I know I never told you that part. One of those I'm saving for tonight. Archie had overheard that at William Campbell's house, that's the stone house that he had helped build, there were arms stored for the secessionists. He also had overheard the men talking about how they had undermined the railroad bridge. Now, the local Union troops are just home guards. They're not federal troops. They're not a wholly formed regiment. But they're assigned and had built a blockhouse the year before that was to guard the railroad bridge. This is a vital link between St. Louis and westward, and a lot of people would have been killed and a lot of bad things could have happened if that bridge had gone down. So Archie took it upon himself. I don't know if he thought about it first, who only knows, but he took it upon himself to run 5 miles at night in the dark and go up and warn the Union troops. Now, I'm going to introduce them tomorrow to a descendant of the man in charge of those troops, and that is Arnold Krekel, who was a German abolitionist himself and a lieutenant colonel. Now, the funny thing is when John asked me, now how do you know that Archie ever even knew of Arnold Krekel or came into contact? And I said, well, it's like this. And it's not every day that a slave comes running in at night and starts screaming about the railroads being undermined. If you don't think that they took him to the commanding officer, I can't document that he talked exactly with Arnold, but he was in charge of the troops. So at that point, it's sort of like, it could have been in the camp and been what's called contraband. But at that point, too, he must have realized, oh, they're going to figure out who told him. And it did. It spread real fast, and he was under suspicion. So at that point, without telling his wife, his kids, he can't say a word to anybody, and he takes off. Now, there's a lot of Germans that live in this area. It had been settled starting in the 1830s and had really grown in a German population. Germans love wine cellars. They make great Underground Railroad stops. Germans are also very understanding of what it means to be free. That was why they had left Germany. So they are very sympathetic and quite often helpful. And actually it's many times mentioned in the book of how it was a German that helped. And who only knows how, but for some reason Archie knew, because he had probably attended the Presbyterian church with his master, and he knew where to go. He takes off that night and he heads towards St. Louis. He gets as far as the Missouri River, gets south of the river, is hiding in the reeds, and gets caught. He and a couple of other fugitive slaves that must have all thought it was a good hiding space, all got caught and put up at a tavern, probably in the DePere area. They're south of the Missouri River, and he is headed for another Presbyterian church too. And it's ironic, but this is probably the route that he took. He was caught up and put up in an inn, and on the second floor. And what happened next was the men stayed downstairs and got drunk, the bounty hunters, and the fugitive slaves, the two other guys, they sort of went ahead and fell asleep. Well, Archie doesn't give up that easy, and he's a bit of a carpenter. Remember, he's built a house, and he actually is supposed to have had a hammer with him. And he opens the window, and unfortunately, as he tries to climb out, something falls and makes a noise. But about the same time, he discovers that there's a raccoon that is in the woods, that the dog that is underneath the window guarding them. And the dog takes off after the raccoon and goes that direction, and Archie goes that direction. He makes his way to St. Louis, probably either along Manchester Road, and comes down to the heart of the city of St. Louis. The bounty hunters are tracking him and following him, and they're of course after him. And he makes his way to St. Louis, to Jefferson and Market Street, and it goes into a butcher shop. Now, the owner, a German, it says so, the owner actually turns to Archie and says, "Are you a fugitive slave?" And Archie knows to answer yes. And this man says, "Wait here, give me a little bit of time." And 2 hours later, a woman shows up promptly with a market basket and asks, "Will you carry this home for me?" That woman, just out of the clear blue, just knows to come to the butcher shop and meet up, that there's somebody that needs a place to stay. She takes him home. Her name is Abigail Adams Cranch Elliott. She takes him home to her husband and introduces Archie to him, and they talk a bit, and Archie gets hired to be his gardener. This is the beginning of a very long and wonderful relationship between Elliott and Archer Alexander. William Greenleaf Elliott is a Unitarian minister. He also is the founder of Washington University. This man was an abolitionist. He had already said, "I don't know exactly what I'll do if I ever find myself in the position of having a slave that needs to be returned." But at that point, he decided what he would do. He had heard Archie's story. He knew that by law, Archie should be freed and emancipated. He knew that, but it was not gonna be an easy thing to do. And he puts Archie up and hires him as a gardener. Archie stays at his house, which is in St. Louis, called Beaumont Place. Beaumont Place is named that for the General Beaumont. It's supposed to have been built in about 1828 by Hamilton Rowan Gamble. Hamilton Gamble later on became governor of Missouri. But here's Archie, and here he is living. This may seem like a nice, pleasant, easy getaway. Okay. When William G. Elliott came to Missouri in 1834, he started the Unitarian Church here in St. Louis. At the time that they just moved into that house called Beaumont Place, it's May of 1861. It's the very first days they've moved in, and there's the event that so many of us call the Camp Jackson affair. Elliott actually describes the bullets coming close to the house. This is the site of the contraband camps, the Benton barracks, and so much activities. And I don't want to get off into the big story of Camp Jackson, but essentially this was the Union troops trying to hold the arms for the Union Army. And this was the very first major Civil War event in St. Louis. And so likewise, here they are right in the heart of it. They're right in the middle of everything. And Elliott has done one other thing in the Civil War. He's established the Western Sanitary Commission. Sounds like a nice, official, funny kind of name. He was a close friend of Lincoln. He knew what was going on. He was in the inner circle and in the influence. The Western Sanitary Commission had been started with James Yeatman and with Jesse Benton Fremont and a few others, but essentially it was the three of them. And what it was in charge of was aiding the freemen, the fugitive slaves, providing aid to all the Union camps for especially for the contraband and for the and fugitive slaves. They were especially helpful all the way down to Helena, Arkansas, and movement of goods and supplies. And Helena, Arkansas was one of the head stations for the U.S. colored troops. And this is what they're involved in. And here's Archie right in the middle of all of that. And he's there for a few weeks, and it's really sad because what happens is Pittman is so determined that he's not going to let Archie free that he sends a couple of bounty hunters down. Elliott writes of how he started off for work one day and he had his book under an arm and he was not thinking anything of it. This pleasant, idyllic scene of Christopher, his son, is actually playing and Archie is working in the garden. And he never knew until he got home that night, but right after he'd left, bounty hunters had come and beat in front of the children, had beat Archie and hauled him off. And actually, fortunately, still had him at the St. Louis, at the city jail, not realizing that Pittman's request to recapture and bring him back was fake. And as soon as Elliott gets home, Elliott realizes what has happened, and he goes to the St. Louis jail and actually gets it in writing from the lieutenant colonel, who is the provost marshal general, and gets it actually in writing that Archie is verbally, it can even be renewed until, you know, anybody else like the president revokes it. And it's from the event of February 28th, 1863. He retrieves Archer and takes him home. And Elliott is very happy that he's been able to rescue Archie, and Archie is very, very grateful. Now, this statement is made because of the story of right after all of this event. The next thing that happens is Archie wants his wife and his children. He's really missing them. He's hoping that he can bring them to freedom as well. So somehow a German arranges that Archie's wife and Jenny will, who's 13, will actually be able to join him. By this time, it's getting close to emancipation, and actually Elliot knew this was coming. He urged him to just hold tight, but Archie did get a German friend to come and pick them up. So Louisa and Jenny are waiting at a crossroads. They know the appointed spot, and they're standing there nervously waiting, and the German comes up with his wagon and offers them a ride. They climb in the back quietly underneath the corn shucks into the false bottom of the wagon, and he goes on. A little ways down the road, some of the bounty hunters had come up to the wagon and accosted the wagon and asked, "Well, have you seen a woman and a girl?" And the German farmer answers, "Yes, I did, back at the crossroads. They were standing there looking very nervous, like they were waiting for someone. I haven't seen them since." That was how Elliot approached things with this story. Literal truth is sometimes the most ingenious falsehood. He's a minister, after all. So that was what made it so interesting about St. Peter's Cemetery. It was very difficult to understand how Archie and Louisa came to be there. At the end of the Civil War, Louisa was very missing her property and her things from James Naylor. Now James Naylor, her slave owner, was not the nicest of guys. He invited her to come back and retrieve her stuff, and mysteriously 2 days later was dead. He was not favorably looked upon, of course, but here's the important thing, folks. This is why the story is not told in the fashion of all the correct names and people and places. It's an amazing story, and the story itself of all the events and all of the achievements and all the heroic deeds are totally accurate, and they are all easily documented. He changed the names to protect the guilty. James Naylor is, and this part Keith has already heard, but James Naylor, his wife, is sister, she's got this sister that's married to the Attorney General of the United States. Okay? She's got another sister, and she's married to the governor. Now, could you write a book and tell who did what? And still live there? It does not make the story any less important. The story itself is very important. So when we went looking for the actual death place, part of the mystery was trying to figure out why. And Keith and I have worked a lot on that, and that's a very interesting part of the story too, because in the book, Elliot is not only sharing all these stories of this adventure and Archer's life, but he shares some side notes that we're still trying to figure out, why is this here? For instance, he talks about a little girl, 4 years old, and she's an orphan, and she's white, but Elliot suggests that perhaps she's attached to Archer. She might do better adopted by another family, and talks Archer into that, letting that happen. And it does. And then he goes a few months afterwards and he goes to visit her, and she doesn't remember him whatsoever. So Terry, this part's for you. Turns out, after we were able to find where St. Peter's and that she was there, the area is got some history that does deal with some of the Germans, with the orphanages and the nuns and that. Because after we learned where Archer was living when he died, we learned that it was an orphanage. And that orphanage moved out to that area. And that is probably why, because Julia learned how to speak German. That orphanage only hired Germans or from slaves that could speak German. So I know everybody knows Doris has got to get some German in there. But it shows the cross-culture, it shows the interaction, it shows the part of society, it shows that they weren't all James Nailers, they weren't all out to own property and divide them up as if no account other than their value. So when Archer had heard about this monument, he was so elated. In 1876, this monument was placed in Washington, D.C. in Lincoln Park. It had been started by a lady named Charlotte Scott, who had formerly been enslaved, and at the end of the Civil War, the first thing she did was take the first money that she made, and she took it to her former master, whose name was Rucker, and said to him, I think there should be a memorial to President Lincoln for what he's done for the people. Now, Rucker turned to his friend, named William G. Greenleaf Eliot, and said, can you help us with this? So they were raising funds, and the Western Sanitary Commission got involved in that too. Now, all of the funds for the monument were raised by African Americans that were enslaved. The very first plan for it was to be the little image that you see on the side on the right, and it was to be a former slave, and he was in a sort of military cap, a captain cap thing. Well, that could have actually even represented Archer's son, because he did have a son that had joined the U.S. colored troops and did die during the Civil War. We're still working on that. But for some reason, Thomas Ball changed the plans. Now, Thomas Ball comes from Boston, just like William Greenleaf Eliot. And actually, a lot of people think of him as an Italian sculptor, because the sculpture was made and cast in Italy. What had happened was Thomas Ball had grown up in Boston. He's a contemporary of Eliot. And he was actually, had gone to Italy to learn the craft of sculpting, but had come back and was actually in the States and could have actually met Eliot and Archer sometime before 1865 when he went back to Italy. But according to Eliot, he did share a picture of Archer and suggested that this man would be a better representation of the former slave rising on one knee and breaking his chains because of his story. I'm sure the book was written to share the story of why the monument is so important, and so that we'd all know why. So, thank you. From Slavery to Freedom.
What is the name of the orphan home in North St. Louis?
What is,
What is the name of the
I'm
orphan?
not sure if it was St. Vincent's or what one. It's a, I've been talking with Dr. John Wright about it and trying to understand the correlation. There is a sisters that are some black nuns in St. Louis on Morgan Street, and they have supposedly go out to North County in 1880. So maybe you two can help me with that,
The
Terry?
orphan home is probably St. Vincent's.
That's what I've been thinking, but nobody would answer my emails.
Slauson Road, right off of Natural Bridge.
And you can see it right
You
behind
can
the
see it right
cemetery.
off of the cemetery. Well, it's a little bit down, a little bit further west.
Mhm.
The other orphan home she talks about is St. Francis,
Okay,
which is a black orphan homes or black girls daycare centers. That was a little bit west of there. But the orphan home that you're looking for is St. Vincent's, and it's still in operation.
Oh,
So they still should have some type of records.
Oh, they do?
They do have some records there.
I'll hook you up.
Mhm.
Yeah, check with her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, actually, when when Archie died, he's living on Morgan Street, which is Del Mar. And, he's 2626. And it was Keith's great research that he one night, says, Doris, do you know that 19 people died in 10 years at that address? I'm like, how did you find that out?
That's right. I think that's why they moved out to,
They
that's
did.
one of the reasons why they moved out to Normandy.
Because of the
The cholera.
Because of the cholera.
Cholera.
Yeah.
2 or 3
1849
times.
was a big year for lots of death in St. Louis, right?
Yeah.
cholera.
Archie died in 1880, and supposedly with John Wright's book, he says that they moved out there in 1880. So,
That's probably where.
my
that's
theory
probably-
is that
that's
because
probably
it,
where.
yeah,
It-
because most of these deaths, he had extracted it from research about African Americans buried in Greenwood. And they're buried there, but the ages are 0, 0, 0. There's a lot of babies and young girls.
And St. Peter's had a black section that was in the back, and then they had the regular Methodist
UCC.
UCC in the front part of it, so.
And the UCC church is one of the earliest German churches that has started. They led to Emmaus House and the Synod and so much, so many good things. It was an evangelical church to begin with. So they were there early on, and I have a strong suspicion that that's the connection with who they were working for, because Julia dies a year before Archie, and she's buried there. It's a common lot. It is several hundred unmarked graves, and it's essentially a pauper's lot, a common lot. And that is actually what led us on to the fact that Eliot's story is a great story, but he wasn't buried at Centenary. And all the things that we learned because of that.
How were you able to find the names of people buried here?
Well, that I owe to Jim left. Oh, I am sorry. Oh, I wished okay. What happened was, when he asked, and I started looking, if you go to Eliot's book, it says he's buried in Centenary, and that the service was on Lucas, 11th and Lucas, and that he's buried at Centenary near the courthouse. And Keith had been to St. Louis a few years ago and had actually tried to find what became of all the people buried at Centenary. And of course, we know the Clayton Courthouse today, and there's nothing there of old cemeteries anymore. They've all been moved. And we just figured that. But Jim Genzel, another volunteer with me at Bell Fountain, had helped me, and he was researching Centenary records, and we couldn't find him. And then we started searching all the other area African American cemeteries, any cemetery, and really was trying very hard to figure it out. And Jim had come across in the index, the St. Louis Genealogical Society, it took a lot of the cemetery records from all over St. Louis, and they indexed them from the microfilm. And Jim had come across an entry that said, Olvey, Olvhey, Olvey Alexander, but it had the right year and the right date. And he had that, and he sent me that link on the index. And I admit, I didn't even look at it right off because I thought, UCC cemetery for, no. And then one day I took some time and I opened it up, and the first thing I noticed after I saw this was that Julia's buried there as well. Well, of course, that's the first place you should look if you're doing genealogy and you can't find somebody. They're going to be buried near their spouse. So here was Julia, and she's buried there the year before. So I had 4 points out of 5. It was just this crazy thing of Olvey, and I couldn't figure it out. So I went over there and very persistent and got him to show me the actual handwriting. And you know that old script. It wasn't O-L-V, it was A-R-C-H-E-Y. So today they all got a certified copy from the St. Louis Recorder of Deeds of the 1880 death. And it actually, even on that, as a second source, says St. Peter's UCC Cemetery.
Doris, can I ask you a question? Has there been any contact with Alexander, who wrote the Rattling of the Chains?
I haven't heard a word from him. There is another individual that has written a book about Archer Alexander. You're right, Errol Alexander. The thing that I have a problem with on that ancestry that he cites, he says he is the descendant of a James Alexander. In 1870, there's a 15-year-old James Alexander living with Archie and his second wife, Julia. And from what we can determine from all of the records that we have found so far, that James, born in 1855, it could be a grandson, or that James could be a son of Julia's by another marriage.
Okay.
So I don't quite understand the connection, because Errol does talk a lot about, he feels that the Archie Alexander that he's tracking has a white father back in history with a slave mother. And of course, you all know from all the great DNA research that Keith has done that his DNA goes straight back to Africa and doesn't have that.
He spent 30 years writing this book with that about the connection. So you're saying that there's some discrepancy?
The paternal haplogroup is a haplogroup that goes to Africa. It goes to Africa. It doesn't go to Europe.
Oh, okay.
And Archer's paternal haplogroup was the same as George's,
Right.
and it's the same as Stephen, the guy that I match.
Right.
And when you look at that haplogroup, it goes to Africa. It doesn't go.
Oh, so does that explain why we haven't been able to contact him, or he has put a reason?
I know that Keith has tried.
Tried.
Yeah.
Nobody's.
Nobody's
I don't know.
heard from him.
I hope he's okay. I don't know.
Yeah.
Where does he live? Where did he live?
In the state of Washington, I believe?
Washington.
Outside of Seattle.
Oh, okay.
Yes, Julie.
Why do you think that during his escape, Archie ended up in New Hampshire and then went along Manchester Road?
For several reasons. One, we know that connections that, let's be real, that the slaves, they have ears, and they're not considered people. So the owners don't cover or think about their words as they're talking. And they hear things. This is how he knows everything that's going on. And they also go to church with them. They live their whole life based around what their owners are doing. So we know that they were very involved in the Presbyterian church there. Not only that, but in the book, as Elliot lays it out, he explains that he's on the south side of the river. He explains on how he is on a major road that leads straight into, from the area into St. Louis.